It was the fourth week since Arjun had left for his overseas work assignment, and the silence in the house had started to feel heavier than the walls themselves. Mira stood by the kitchen window, her hands loosely wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea, staring blankly at the rolling fields beyond their farmhouse. The wind swayed the tall grass gently, but her heart remained still, numb, aching, and unsure of what exactly it was longing for. Arjun had always been a dependable husband, organized, responsible, careful with words, and even more cautious with affection. Their marriage, now in its 8th year, had settled into a routine that felt more like partnership than passion. There was no bitterness, but there was no fire either. Just a shared schedule and occasional polite gestures passed between two people who once couldn't keep their hands off each other. Her eyes wandered beyond the fields, to the barn where her horse, Raja, stood tethered in his stable. Since childhood, Mira had found inexplicable comfort in the presence of horses. They didn't talk, but somehow they understood. With Raja, there was no need to pretend. No forced smiles, no half-hearted conversations. Just presence, warm, grounding presence. She walked outside, the gravel crunching beneath her sandals. As she reached the barn, Raja neighed softly, gently nudging his head toward her shoulder. Mira smiled for the first time in days, stroking the smooth ridge of his neck. Here, she felt seen, oddly more than she did in the company of her husband. That's when Karen entered her life again, unannounced, unexpected, and completely out of place. He was a childhood friend, once a mischievous boy from the neighboring village, now a well-built, rugged man working with a local real estate agency. Their paths hadn't crossed in years. But that afternoon, while she brushed Raja's mane, she heard his voice behind her. "Didn't expect to find you here, still in love with horses, I see." She turned, startled, her heart skipping in a way it hadn't in a long time. "Karen?" she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "God, you've changed." "And you haven't," he replied with a half-smile that carried the same mischief he'd had in his eyes as a teenager. "Still beautiful. Still grounded." His gaze lingered a moment too long, and Mira felt a subtle warmth rise under her skin. She didn't look away. They talked for a while. Nothing deep, just old memories, mutual friends, and what life had done to them in the years gone by. But beneath the laughter and small talk, a strange current ran, unspoken, but undeniable. Later that night, Mira lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan whirring quietly above. Arjun had called earlier, the conversation brief and functional. "How's everything?"
"Fine."
"Same as always." "Okay. Sleep well." "You too." And then silence. But Mira's mind wasn't quiet. It replayed Karen's smile, the way he had looked at her. Not like a wife, not like someone's possession, but like a woman. A woman who still had something to be desired, something worth lingering over. She turned to her side, closing her eyes, trying to shake the thought away. But it clung to her like the scent of rain on dry soil, uninvited, yet unmistakably familiar. The next morning, as she fed Raja and prepared for another uneventful day, her phone buzzed. "Karen, if you're free later, I'd love to see you again."
"Just to talk."
She stared at the message longer than necessary, her fingers hovering over the screen. She hadn't realized how much she craved attention, real attention, not the kind that came from shared calendars and goodnight texts, but the kind that made you feel seen, wanted, chosen. She didn't reply. Not yet. But her heart had already whispered the answer she didn't want to admit aloud. Mira didn't respond to Karen's message that morning, but the thought of it followed her like a shadow. Every mundane task, watering the plants, folding laundry, reheating leftovers, felt strangely amplified, as if her body was present in routine, but her mind was suspended elsewhere, caught in the undertow of something unfamiliar, yet oddly exhilarating. By late afternoon, the silence of the house had become oppressive again. Arjun's absence echoed in everything: the untouched armchair in the living room, the cold side of the bed, the unopened bottle of wine they once promised to enjoy together. Mira's fingers hovered over her phone screen before she finally typed a simple reply. Coffee sounds nice. 5 p.m. Karen's response was almost immediate. Perfect. I'll pick the place. She told herself it was harmless. Just coffee. Just a conversation. But when she stood in front of her wardrobe, agonizing over what to wear, the truth weighed heavier than her own excuses. She settled on a soft cream-colored kurti, simple, yet elegant. Not too much. Not too little. Just enough to feel noticed. They met at a quiet cafe tucked behind an old bookstore, a place that smelled of roasted beans and nostalgia. Karen was already seated by the window when she arrived, his fingers tracing circles around his cup absent-mindedly. When he looked up, his eyes lingered, and for a moment, Mira felt like she had walked into a story rather than a cafe. "You look radiant," he said, standing up. She laughed nervously, brushing her hair behind her ear. "You always were dramatic. And you were always too modest," he replied, pulling out a chair for her. Their conversation was light at first, books, travel, childhood memories. But as the sun dipped lower, their words grew bolder, edged with curiosity and subtle provocation. "Are you happy, Mira?" Karen asked suddenly, his voice low, steady. She hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. She glanced outside at the dusky sky before speaking. "I don't know. Maybe I'm comfortable. Maybe that's not the same thing." Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched her closely, as if searching for parts of her that she herself had forgotten. "You used to laugh more," he said softly. "You used to dream louder." His words cut through her like a whisper through silence. She wanted to argue, to defend the life she had built with Arjun, to name the sacrifices and the stability. But deep down, she knew Karen wasn't wrong. He was just inconveniently honest. Time slipped by unnoticed. When they stepped outside, the sky was cloaked in twilight. Karen walked her to her car, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was a pause, thick with unsaid things. A glance too long. A breath too shallow. "I'm glad you came," he said finally. "I shouldn't have," Mira replied, her voice barely audible. "But you did," he answered, taking a step closer. "And that means something." She turned away before he could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between duty and desire playing out across her face. That night, the silence in the house was no longer neutral, it was charged. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind felt amplified. She sat on the edge of the bed, her phone glowing beside her with unread messages from Arjun, brief, logistical updates that lacked warmth. Her thumb hovered over Karen's name again. "I don't know what I'm doing," she typed. Then deleted it. "Today was nice." She deleted that too. Instead, she switched off the phone and stared into the darkness, unsure if she was trying to silence the noise in her mind or the voice in her heart. In the early hours of the morning, she walked to the barn. Raja stirred in his stall, his eyes blinking slowly in the dim light. Mira rested her head against his neck, drawing in his calm energy. There was no judgment in his presence, no questions, no expectations, just comfort. But even that comfort couldn't erase the truth taking root inside her, a truth that frightened her even as it thrilled her. She was standing at a threshold. One step forward could change everything, and she wasn't sure anymore if she wanted to stay behind. The days that followed Mira's coffee with Karen felt like a slow unraveling. Nothing in her world had outwardly changed, yet everything inside her had shifted. Her hands still prepared Arjun's favorite meals, her chores remained the same, and she still whispered goodnight into an empty room. But now, beneath every routine, there was an undercurrent, a pulse of longing, a weight of unsaid words. Karen hadn't texted again. Not immediately. And somehow, that made his presence stronger. His silence echoed in her thoughts, daring her to remember the way he looked at her, the warmth in his voice, the dangerous softness in his eyes. Then came the second message, short, simple, and disarming. "Are you thinking about it too?" Mira didn't reply. Not right away. But her body answered before her mind could. She saw it in how often she checked her phone, how her heart picked up pace every time a message arrived, even if it wasn't from him. That weekend, she met him again. This time, not at a cafe, but at the edge of the lake where they used to spend summers as teenagers, throwing stones, making dares, and dreaming about futures that never came. "I didn't think you'd come," Karen said, watching her approach, hands in his pockets. "I shouldn't have," she replied, echoing the same words she'd spoken days ago. But the tone was different now. Less resistance. More surrender. They sat by the water in silence for a while. The evening was thick with humidity, dragonflies dancing above the rippling surface. Mira tried to distract herself with the view, but Karen's presence pressed against her thoughts. "When did everything get so complicated?" she asked quietly. Karen shrugged. "Maybe it's always been complicated. We just learned to ignore it." Mira turned toward him, her eyes tracing his face. There were lines now where there used to be smooth skin, a roughness in his features, a maturity she hadn't known she craved. "Do you love him?" he asked suddenly. She didn't answer. "Or are you just used to him?" "That's not fair," she said, but even she didn't believe the protest. Karen leaned closer, his voice lower now. "Tell me to stop. Say the word, and I'll walk away." But she couldn't. Instead, she closed her eyes, unsure if it was permission or confession. The moment that followed wasn't explosive. It wasn't rushed. It was quiet, slow, and devastatingly deliberate. A touch of his fingers brushing hers. A look held too long. A kiss that felt less like betrayal and more like discovery. And just like that, the line was crossed. When she returned home that night, her world looked the same, but she knew it wasn't. The air felt heavier. The walls echoed differently. Even Raja, waiting by the barn gate, looked at her with his usual calm, unaware of the storm she now carried inside. She tried to sleep, but guilt crept in through the cracks she had tried to seal with longing. Arjun's messages came as usual, routine, thoughtful, unaware. "Thinking of you. Just one more week until I'm back." A week. Just 7 days. But what was left to return to? She didn't know if it was regret or clarity she felt, but something inside her had shifted. Not because she had betrayed Arjun, but because she had awakened to a version of herself she thought had been buried by years of monotony and compromise. The next morning, she stood by the mirror, staring at her reflection, not with shame, but with confrontation. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. Or maybe for the first time, she truly did. By noon, she had typed a message to Karen. "I don't know where this goes, but I can't pretend anymore." She paused, deleted it, then typed again. "I need to figure out who I am. Alone. Without you. Without him." This time, she hit send. Later, she walked out to the barn and rested her forehead against Raja's side. The silence was comforting again. Not empty, not oppressive. Just stillness. Just breath. And for the first time in weeks, Mira didn't feel lost. She felt uncertain, yes, but not broken. She had crossed a line. But maybe that line had been the only way to see where she truly stood.